Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? I figured while I'm talking about dice, I might as well talk about a bunch of my favorite RPG dice mechanics. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. I'm not really sure, there's no real hierarchy because it really depends. And I may find another mechanic tomorrow that I like and that should have been at the top of this list. So, it's by no means, the end all be all list. And also looking at these, there's nothing that really stands out because every dice mechanic has things that it does well, things that it doesn't do as well. And so it really depends upon the intention and what kind of feel you want and all that kind of good stuff. So in no particular order, percentile dice, D100, whether it's BRP or something else. This is an incredibly useful, flexible, and intuitive system. It's really easy to figure out what your chance of successes are because it's in the name. You have a skill of 67, well, you have a 67% chance of success here. This system scales incredibly well in terms of degrees of success or failure, in terms of modifiers, in terms of modeling competency, all that kind of stuff, because it's so granular. So it works extraordinarily well. It's a great system. And in something like BRP, it'll even tell you that if you have a particular degree of competence, if you have a skill of 60 or whatever the heck it happens to be, well, if the situation is not dire, if you're under no time pressure, if you're operating at your level of competence versus a task that's at your level of competence, well, then you don't necessarily need to roll dice. Now, that's more of a procedural thing. I want to stick to the mechanics, but that's really cool. D20. That is like D100 light. It doesn't scale as well. It has some drawbacks in terms of that sort of stuff, but it's a really down and dirty way of representing percentile chances in discrete 5% chunks. It's something that we can wrap our head around a little bit easier. It has its own set of modifiers. It certainly has a sense of nostalgia for me because it was part of the central mechanic of the game I first learned to play in 1981. I'm not so much of a fan of the D20 system, but we're really talking about the dice mechanic. And so the D20 definitely has its place. I like that mechanic an awful lot. Roll and sort dice pools, things like Ubiquity, where you roll a bunch of dice. You have a bunch of dice depending upon your final skill level and something, your skill plus your attribute. And then based on the number of successes you get, you compare that to the number of successes you need. It's a great system. It models degrees of competence extraordinarily well. It models degrees of success or failure extraordinarily well. It's really easy to figure out, well, what do I need to do here? Because literally your final skill is the number of dice you need to pick up and roll. You can look at the number of dice you have divided by 2 and compare that with the number of successes that you need for a particular task because the difficulty scales extraordinarily well as with the number of successes you need. And if that's half your die pool is equal to the difficulty level, then if you're actually playing Ubiquity, once again, the game tells you if you're not under no time pressure, if it's not an unusual situation, this is what you should be able to do normally, and so you don't necessarily have to roll dice. But, it's a great system, and, systems like it, roll and sort dice pool systems, are phenomenal. Step dice. Systems where the size of the die that you roll is dependent upon your skill or your attribute or something. There's different ways that games handle this. I want to say it's Cortex, although I could be wrong, where you're rolling a D20 and then you're adding another die as a modifier, whether it's a D4, D6, D8, D10, D12. I think it's Cortex. But in other words, you're taking another die based on your skill and adding that to that D20 roll. And, or other systems where you're just rolling those dice. That's pretty cool. It's a cool way of modeling your competence. Games like Blade Runner, I really enjoy because you're rolling 2 dice all the time. One is based on your attribute, one is based on your skill, and once again, you're using different size dice from D6 to D12 to model those kind of things. I need to do a video on the Blade Runner dice mechanic because I looked at it in detail and in depth and figured out percentage chances based on the different combinations and advantage and disadvantage and all that kind of stuff. When I ran Blade Runner, I think it was like a year ago. I really want to run it again, but that's a really cool system. But that's a really neat way of modeling something. And then another thing about systems like that is that the number of successes you get on a die, on a step die, can increase based on the die size. So in other words, on a D6, it's only possible to get 1 success in that particular Blade Runner system because you have to get a 6. But on a D8, well, okay, you have more chances of getting a 6 or greater. On a D10, I believe it was D10, you can get 2 successes on a 10. And of course, on a D12, it's more and more likely. I think I'm not misrepresenting that. But the idea that on those step dice, later on, as they become larger, you can even have more success than you would have on a single die. Things like that, really, really cool, really, really interesting, really neat ways to model stuff based on, very little, very few dice. So that's cool. 1d6. It's a great system. It's an oldie, but I once again, it's one of those things that has a special place in my heart. But having a 1 and 6, 2 and 6, 3 and 6, 4 and 6, 5 and 6 chance of something, it's neat little discrete steps. And if you look at other dice mechanics and see how they work, so even something like the roll and sort ubiquity dice mechanic, you start to see, man, this is really, really close. And you can just break out that one die and use it and have a pretty satisfying RPG session. D12. Pythagoras liked it. It's an underused die. It has a special place in my heart. Things like Broken Rooms use the D12. Dark Age of Man uses the D12. It's D6 on steroids. It's broken down into even more discrete steps. And once again, it does a really good job of representing various degrees of competence or difficulty and all that kind of stuff. It's a great alternative to the D20, not as many data points. Really cool die. So it should be used more. 2d6, oldie but a goodie, a great mechanic. It does certain things well. It has a smaller bell curve. Some people would argue, well, it's really a point. You get the idea. It can model degrees of success or failure relatively well. It's definitely constrained. It definitely has its limitations. We've already talked about that. But it's still a pretty cool system, or die mechanic. And things like PBTA, Apocalypse World, they have an interesting take on that. Yes, normally you will have a success with complications. That's just the way that thing works. But it's a neat, for 2 dice, it can provide an awful lot of information. Okay, another one, maybe not one of my favorites, but still a small group of dice that can do a really decent job of modeling degrees of competence are the fudge dice, the dice they use in Fate. Not my favorite system, but it's still, if you look at the curve, pretty cool way of doing that. Equally cool is the D6 minus D6 system, which gets really, really close to modeling the Fate or fudge curve. And if you look, you roll D6, you roll another D6 of a different color, subtract that one, find out do you have a positive or negative modifier. It does a pretty good job, actually, of modeling that same sort of curve. Let's see, what else? Fantasy Flight Games narrative dice. I like those an awful lot. I keep on meaning, and I was talking to my friend Francois Letarte when he was down, keep on meaning to run a game where we're not necessarily using the Genesis system or the Star Wars system as such, but we're simply rolling those dice, looking at the information they provide us. Did you succeed or did you fail? Do you have threat? Do you have advantage? Do you have a triumph? Do you have a despair? And then, describing what happens based upon our understanding of what those things mean. Not necessarily looking at the charts in the books, but, taking the basic spirit of what those dice, are telling us. I like that whole idea of it. It's giving you the yes or no, but, here's all these other things. And so now you need to, make more stuff up. And it gives you cues to do that. I think it's awesome. Any dice system that gives you more information than just yes or no is pretty cool and has its place. Let's see. Look for D6 dice pools where you're looking for sixes. Those are really cool. Something like Alien. I really enjoyed using that system where the more dice you're rolling, clearly the more chances of a 6 you're going to get. And in that particular system, if you choose to re-roll, then if you get ones, well, really bad stuff happens. I like that kind of system. It's pretty cool. There's a moment when you're doing those re-rolls where you have to frame those re-rolls in a way where it doesn't interfere with your immersion in the moment, immersion in the fiction. And there's ways to do it where it doesn't feel so meta. But I like those basic, those dice pool systems. Even something like, Raji introduced that in one of the supplements for Lamentations of the Flame Princess as an alternative to the regular saving throws, where you roll a bunch of D6s based upon your attribute. And the greater your attribute, the more D6s you roll. And you have to get a 6 or you fail the save. It's a pretty cool system. And then let's see, last but not least, systems where you're looking for matches. Broken Compass is a really, really cool one where you're rolling a bunch of D6s and you're looking for pairs or three of a kind or four of a kind, and depending upon your skill, you get to roll more dice. And then these matches, whatever they are, a little bit like Yahtzee, well, they correspond to difficulties that are in your environment. Well, now you can overcome that one without, having to suffer the consequences of not overcoming it. Really, really cool stuff. There's all kinds of creative things that people have done with dice. And, once again, at some point you have to, or I prefer to, look at them under the hood, run the numbers, see what's really happening. Does this thing really do or really model things well? What is it pushing towards? All that kind of thing. And then sometimes you get surprised and find out that the dice system really pushes in a direction you didn't really anticipate it was going to. Sometimes designers pair them with their intention and pair them with the game really, really well. And man, does this thing do what it's supposed to do? Other times, well, not as good. But just looking at the mechanics themselves, these are some that I really, really like, that, I enjoy using, that if I, would want to come up with a game on the fly and like, what mechanic do I want to use? These are some of the ones I would use based on what kind of feel I want. Pretty cool stuff.